good evening, and welcome back. Wherever you are right now, whether you're driving through somewhere flat and dark, folding laundry in a room that smells like someone else's dinner, or sitting outside in the kind of late summer air that makes you feel slightly untethered from your own life, I'm glad you're here. Drop your location in the comments if you want. I always like knowing where these stories land. Tonight, we're going somewhere old. Older than old. We're going back to the first water, the first word, the first God who decided that knowing things was the same as owning them. This is the story of Enki. Before the waters separated, before anything had a name, there was only Nammu. This is where you have to hold your mind very still, because we are not talking about a beginning in the way you usually mean it. Not a moment, not a flash, not a single point from which everything else unfolds in orderly sequence. We are talking about something more like a condition. Nammu was not the ocean. Nammu was the thing that ocean later would be a word for. She was the primal abyss, the subterranean sweet water pressing against the foundations of a sky that had not yet been separated from the earth. She had no face in the way that later gods would have faces. She had no story yet, because story requires time, and time had not yet been invented. What she had was depth. What she had was patience. What she had coiled inside her like heat inside a stone was everything. The Sumerians called her the mother of everything, but I think even they weren't sure what that meant. The texts that mention her are fragmentary, incomplete, the oldest ones especially, where the cuneiform cuts off and the scholars make their best guesses and put brackets around the uncertainty. She is more gap than presence in the record. What we can say is this: she preceded the gods themselves. She preceded the sky god An, who would later be elevated to supreme authority in the Sumerian pantheon. She preceded even the earth Ki, from whom the name Sumer draws a shadow of its meaning. Nammu was the water before the word for water. Everything else followed. What emerged from Nammu first, and this is where the sources genuinely diverge, where different cities in ancient Mesopotamia told the story in different ways, and none of them cared very much about agreeing, was the union of An and Ki, sky and earth, locked together before they were separated, before sky was sky and earth was earth. They were in the beginning one body, pressed together so tightly that nothing could exist between them. And from that tightness, from that original compression, came Enlil. Enlil was the breath that pushed sky from earth. He was the wind that made the gap. The texts describe his birth as the act of separation itself. He did not simply emerge from the union of An and Ki. He was the force that tore them apart, that drove his parents to their opposite poles so that the space between them could become a world. There is something almost violent about it, something that later cultures would echo in their own cosmogonies. The idea that creation is not peaceful, that making room for existence requires a kind of rupture. The Greeks would do this, the Norse would do this, the Babylonians would do this in the Enuma Elish, with Marduk splitting Tiamat like a fish. But here, in Sumer, it was Enlil who first performed this act, and it was not celebrated with quite the same triumphalism. The texts are quieter about it, almost matter of fact. And then there was Enki. He He was born in the space that Enlil made, or, and some say this, he was born before the separation, in the deep water with Nammu, and the separation simply brought him to light. The disagreement matters. If he was born before the gap, then he belongs to the oldest layer of reality, the layer before order, before hierarchy, before the clean assignment of domains. If he was born after, he is one node in a network of divine beings who are sorting themselves into roles and ranks. The texts support both readings, which means the Sumerians themselves may have held both at once, without finding the contradiction troubling. That is worth sitting with. What is not in dispute? He came from the water. He was the god of the Abzu, the freshwater ocean that the Mesopotamians believed lay beneath the earth, seeping upward through springs and wells, making the rivers run, keeping the soil alive. This was not metaphorical water. This was cosmological water, the sustaining medium of reality, the thing that kept the world from drying out and becoming the desert that waited at every border of Mesopotamian civilization. When they spoke of Enki and the Abzu, they were speaking about something that felt as immediate as the irrigation channels that made their cities possible. The water was not far away. The water was underneath you. His city was Eridu. This is important. Eridu was the first city, or so the Sumerians believed. The place where kingship was lowered from heaven, where the first grain was planted, where the first temple was raised. The Eridu Genesis, as scholars call the fragmentary text that describes the world's beginning and its near end by flood, places Eridu at the center of the human experiment, and Enki was its patron. He was not the most powerful god in the Sumerian pantheon. That honor would eventually go to Enlil, then be fought over, then be wrested by Marduk when Babylon rose to dominance. But Enki was something else. He was the cleverest. He was the one who knew things. The Sumerian word for what Enki embodied was Nammu, which we usually translate as wisdom, but which meant something closer to the accumulation of all technical knowledge, of craft, of magic, of language, of the secrets that made the world work. He held the me, the divine decrees that governed every aspect of civilization, kingship and priesthood, the descent into the underworld and the return from it, music and writing and metalworking and the art of the scribe, the standard of measure and the binding of enemies and the giving of judgments. The me were not abstractions. They were objects in the Sumerian imagination, tablets perhaps, or some kind of sacred instrument that encoded the rules of the cosmos. And Enki had them in his house, in the Abzu, deep beneath the earth where the sweet water ran. The question of how he came to have them is one of those cosmological questions the texts dance around rather than answer directly. Some versions suggest he was given them by An, the Sky Father, as an inheritance or a grant of authority. Others imply he simply had them, that they were part of what it meant to be what he was. The god of wisdom and water and the Abzu comes already equipped with the technology of civilization, because civilization and water are the same thing, fundamentally, in Mesopotamia. You cannot separate the two. The cities grew in the silt between two rivers. The rivers were not decorative. Take the water away, and you have nothing. No grain, no surplus, no specialization of labor, no priests or kings or scribes. Enki holding the me was Enki being what he was. the custodian of everything that made human life possible. But we are getting ahead of ourselves. We are skipping the war. Before there were cities, before there was anything you could call order, there was the settling of the divine hierarchy. And that settling was not gentle. The generation of Enlil and Enki and the other great gods, the Anunna, the children of An, did not simply divide the world amicably and take up their posts. The universe had to be fought over. The first order of business was establishing who mattered more. Enlil held the air. He held the gap between heaven and earth, which meant he held the weather, the storms, the capacity for destruction that the Mesopotamians feared so thoroughly. In the literary texts, he is king of the gods in a practical, functional sense. Even An, the Sky Father, deferred to him in matters of governance. His temple in Nippur, the Ikur, was the house of the mountain. And mountain is what Enlil was, immovable, ancient, the bedrock of cosmic law. When Enlil decreed something, it happened. The flood was his. The destruction of was his. When the cities fell, the Mesopotamian scribes did not blame enemy armies first. They blamed Enlil, who had withdrawn his favor, who had given the order. Enki was different in temperament. The Sumerian literary texts show a god who works laterally, who solves problems with cleverness rather than force, who gets what he wants through understanding rather than command. Where Enlil pronounced, Enki designed. The texts describe him sitting in his Abzu, surrounded by the fish and the reeds and the fresh water that lapped against the edges of the created world, and thinking. He is almost always thinking, or making something, or talking someone into or out of a decision. He argues, he schemes, though rarely in a way that feels malicious. He is the kind of intelligence that looks at a locked box and sees immediately which way the mechanism turns. The rivalry between them, if you can call it that, since the texts never name it quite so simply, was structural. They occupied opposite poles of the Sumerian divine order. Enlil, the authority that descends from above, the storm, the law. Enki, the intelligence that rises from below, the water, the craft. They needed each other in the way that any system needs both decree and execution. But that need did not make their relationship easy. There were other powers too. Ninhursag, the mother goddess, the earth in her fecund form, who participated in the earliest creative acts and whose favor was necessary for birth and growth. Nanna, the moon, whose cycles governed the calendar. Inanna, who would eventually become the most beloved and most terrifying deity in the Mesopotamian imagination. But she belongs to a later chapter of this story, and I will not shortchange her by summarizing her here. The point is that the divine order was not a simple two-party system. It was a court, a bureaucracy, a web of obligations and precedences. And at the center of that web, holding more threads than anyone else, though not always the most visibly powerful, was Enki. The war for primacy in the heavens, if that is what it was, settled itself not through a single great battle, but through a gradual accumulation of precedents, and ceded practical authority to Enlil. Enlil claimed the earth's fate. Enki claimed the deep water and through it, the knowledge that made creation functional. The other gods found their domains. The me were distributed or understood to have been distributed from the beginning. The shape of the cosmos became recognizable. It is around this time, in the mythological sequence, which does not follow chronological time in any way we would recognize, that Enki begins to behave like himself. He builds his house in the Abzu. The texts describe this construction in language so layered with praise that it is almost difficult to extract the details. But what emerges is the image of a vast underwater palace filled with light and music, where the fish gather and the rivers run and the reed beds whisper. He furnishes it with the me. He surrounds himself with advisors, divine craftsmen, the beings who know how to make things work. The house of Enki was not a throne room. It was a workshop. The ordering of the earth came next, and this is one of the richest sections of the Sumerian mythological corpus, a long hymn sometimes called Enki and the World Order, in which the god systematically assigns functions to the rivers, the sea, the rain, the grain, the brick mold, the plough, the yoke, the pickaxe. He blesses the Tigris and the Euphrates, filling them with water, filling them with fish, filling them with the silt that makes fields grow. He calls to the sea, and the sea rises in waves of praise. He goes to Dilmun, the pure land, the place where the sun rises, the Sumerian paradise, and pronounces it blessed. He decrees the function of the cities, giving each its particular divine patron and its particular role in the web of Mesopotamian civilization. This is Enki, the administrator, Enki, the architect of the world's operating system. Every function is assigned, every domain is ordered, every divine official is given a portfolio. The world, by the end of Enki and the world order, feels thoroughly managed. There are no gaps, everything fits, except Inanna. She is not given a domain in this text, and she notices. She goes to Enki and complains, and the conversation that follows is one of the most surprising in Sumerian literature. The two of them essentially arguing about why she has been overlooked, with Inanna listing everything she already does, going into battle, presiding over temples, descending and ascending, and Enki somewhat defensively acknowledging her power while insisting he has not forgotten her, not exactly. The text is damaged here, and the scholars fill in the brackets cautiously, but the impression it leaves is clear. Even in a perfectly ordered cosmos, there are negotiations. There is someone who feels uncounted. The order is not as total as it looks. What broke the order, or rather, what introduced the element that would complicate it forever, was the creation of humanity. The question of why humans exist is one that every major mythology grapples with, and the Sumerian answer is characteristically practical. The gods needed workers. This is not metaphorical. The Atrahasis myth, one of the oldest surviving flood narratives, describes a situation in the early cosmos where the lesser gods, the Igigi, the worker gods who carried the cosmic yoke, were exhausted. They had been digging rivers and hauling earth for so long that they rebelled, burning their tools and marching on Enlil's house at night. Enlil was frightened. The other great gods were convened. And Enki, of course, had an idea. He suggested creating a being to carry the labor, a being made from clay, mixed with the blood of a slaughtered god. There are different versions of which god, and the question of whose blood is more interesting than it might seem, because the identity of the sacrificed divine being determines what kind of thing humanity is from the start. In some versions, it is a rebel god, which means humans are made with rebellion folded into their substance from the beginning. In the Enuma Elish, the Babylonian version, it is Kingu, the champion of Tiamat, who is killed and whose blood mingles with the earth to make the first human. These are not coincidences. The blood matters. What you are made of is what you carry. Enki and Ninhursag together fashioned the first humans. The creation scene in Atrahasis is vivid in its procedural quality. The clay mixed in the womb of the earth, the blood added, the divine intelligence pressed into the material, Ninhursag wiping herself with it, the 14 beings emerging, 7 male and 7 female, the midwives who are themselves divine, gathering around to see. It is clinical and sacred at once, the way that birth always is, the way that making anything is when you know what you're doing. The humans took over the labor. The Igigi rested. The cosmic order was restored, more or less. But the humans required feeding. They required medicine. They required the knowledge of how to survive in a world that was always trying to kill them. Flood and drought and disease and the dark. And this is where Enki's role becomes most interesting, most complicated, most human in its own way. He was their patron. He was the one who gave them the arts of civilization, who taught them the crafts, who sent his advisor Adapa to the first man to instruct him in the rituals of the temple and the knowledge of the sacred. He advocated for them when Enlil wanted to destroy them. Again and again and again, across multiple myths in slightly different forms, Enki stood between the human world and its annihilation. Why? The texts do not say directly, and I find myself, I'm going to be honest, this is one of those moments where the honest thing is more interesting than the tidy thing. I find myself not entirely sure what to make of it. Is it paternal affection? Is it pride of craftsmanship, the maker who protects what he made? Is it something more like pragmatism, the water god who knows that the rivers mean nothing without someone to farm the fields they water? The Sumerian mythological texts are not in the habit of explaining divine motivation in the way that, say, a novel would. The gods do things. The things they do tell you what kind of gods they are. Enki protects humans because Enki is the kind of god who protects humans. There is a story that illustrates this more precisely than any other. The story of Adapa. Adapa was the first king or the first sage. The distinction barely holds in Sumerian thought, where sacred knowledge and political authority were never cleanly separated, and Enki's particular favorite. He had been given the me of wisdom, the full measure of divine knowledge of the craft of the Abgallu, the sage advisors who would later be remembered as 7 fishmen who rose from the sea before each great flood to teach humanity what it needed to know. Adapa was one of these, perhaps the first of these, and Enki had shaped him with unusual care. He had given him a mouth that could speak truth, a heart that was a full measure of the craft of heaven and earth, but he hadn't given him eternal life. The story goes like this. Adapa was fishing in the Persian Gulf, gathering fish for the temple at Eridu, when a south wind came and capsized his boat. He cursed the south wind, and then, because Adapa was Adapa, because Enki had given him real power, the south wind stopped blowing. For 7 days, the south wind ceased, and the world noticed and noticed. He summoned Adapa to the heavens to explain himself. This was an audience before the supreme sky god. and it should have been terrifying. But Enki, always watchful, always running his calculations, prepared his protege. He told him what to say, who would be at the gate of heaven, how to bow, and what offerings to make. And then he told him something that would define the story forever. If they offer you food and water while you are in heaven, do not eat, do not drink. What is offered to you will be the food of death. Adapa went to heaven. He charmed the gatekeepers. He stood before An and explained himself with such eloquence that An was moved not to anger but to curiosity. And then An, wanting to honor this remarkable human, ordered that the bread of life and the water of life be brought to him. Adapa refused. Remembering what Enki had told him, he declined the food and declined the water. He was sent back to earth, full of the craft of heaven and earth, full of wisdom and skill, but still mortal, still bound to die, and laughed, some texts say. He laughed with something that might have been sorrow, might have been amusement, might have been the expression that the powerful sometimes make when they see how the lesser things have been played. Because the food offered to Adapa had not been the food of death, it had been the food of life. The water offered had been the water of immortality. Enki, whether through a mistake or a misunderstanding or an act of deliberate intervention in the divine plan, or some combination of all three, had told his favorite human not to take the thing that would have made him a god. Some say Enki was protecting him, that the food of immortality would have been dangerous for a human, would have changed him in ways Enki could not foresee, would have upset the balance. Some say Enki was afraid that a human with immortality would become something too much like the gods, would tip the careful hierarchy that kept the Abzu safe. Some say, and this reading is the one that troubles me most, the one I keep returning to, that Enki simply made a mistake, that the smartest god in the Sumerian pantheon, the god of wisdom and craft and the full knowledge of the cosmos, miscalculated or calculated correctly and still got it wrong. Adapa returned to earth. He lived as kings live, as sages live, with tremendous power and tremendous limitation. He taught, he advised. He was the first in the line of 7 Abgallu who would carry the knowledge of the gods into the human generations, each one appearing before a great flood to transmit what was needed. He died. This is the shape of the gift Enki gave, immense, transformative, and always, always one thing short of everything. Let me collect the thread. There are several of them by now, and they will all pull tighter before this is over. There is Ninsen's son, the great king who would rule Uruk, and whose story the cuneiform tablets would preserve across 4,000 years. There is the craftsman of the gods who built what could not be built without divine hands. There is the woman who descended into the underworld and whose return changed the shape of the seasons. And there is the flood. But before any of them, there is one more thing to understand about Enki. What he built in the Abzu was a library, not a palace, not primarily. What he built was a repository of every kind of knowing, a place where the me were held and tended, and where anyone who wanted to claim them would have to come to him. Inanna came. She went to Eridu, to the Abzu, and she drank beer with Enki. The texts describe the scene with a pleasure that is almost domestic. The two of them sitting together, the god of wisdom and the goddess of love and war, drinking the sacred beer while the feast was laid out. Enki praised her. He told her what she was, lifted her up in the words of the hymn, named her power, and then drunk, or perhaps performing drunkenness in the way that very clever people sometimes perform it, he began to give her the me. He gave them one at a time. The texts list them, more than 100, in waves. The descent to the underworld, the ascent from the underworld, the art of the hero, the art of power, the shrine of the descent, the throne of kingship, the descent of a king, the ascent of a king, the plundering and the standing firm, the art of the wise woman, the carrying of weapons, the art of the prostitute, the art of the alehouse, the art of the good rejoicing, the art of music, on and on, the full catalogue of human civilization, given piece by piece to Inanna as she sat across from him and drank. When Enki sobered up, the me were gone. They were on Inanna's boat, the boat of heaven, already moving across the water toward Uruk, toward the city that would become the greatest city in the ancient world. And Enki, suddenly understanding what had happened, sent his servant Isimud to stop her. He did not succeed. The messengers he sent, divine fish, divine monsters, the various creatures of the Abzu, caught up with her at each port. But Inanna had made the me fast and would not surrender them. She arrived at Uruk, the people celebrated, the me were distributed, and Enki, in the end, blessed the outcome. He made peace. He sent gifts. This is the moment I keep returning to because I cannot decide what it means. Was Enki tricked? The drunk god handing away civilization's blueprints to the young goddess who came with flattery and beer. That reading makes him look foolish, or at least unwatchful. But Enki, in every other story, is not unwatchful. He is the one who watches, the one who knows in advance. Was this, the giving away of the me, the apparent defeat, and then the gracious acceptance of the outcome? Was this also a calculation? Did he give Inanna the me on purpose, knowing she was the right vessel for them, knowing they needed to move from the deep water to the city? Was the whole scene theatre a beautiful performance of divine politics in which everyone got what they needed and the pretense of theft saved the appearances? I don't know. I genuinely don't know. And I think that's the right response to Enki, actually. He is the god whose depths you cannot see, because he is the depth itself, and depth by definition obscures its own bottom. The flood was Enlil's idea. This is the part of the story that the tablets return to most often, that the later cultures, the Babylonians, the Assyrians, the unknown scribes of Genesis, would carry forward in their own voices, adapted but recognizable, the argument for destroying humanity. The reasons Enlil gave varied in different versions. Sometimes humanity had grown too numerous, and their noise disturbed the god's sleep, which sounds almost comic, but was probably not meant to be. Sometimes humanity had been too sinful. Sometimes the motive was not given at all. Enlil simply decided, and the divine assembly agreed, and the flood was decreed. But Enki knew, he always knew, and he found the man who needed to know. His name was Ziusudra in the earliest Sumerian versions, Utnapishtim in the Akkadian, Noah in the version that most people reading this have heard. The mechanism by which Enki warned him varied. In some texts, he spoke to Ziusudra in a dream. In others, he spoke through a wall, technically keeping his vow of silence to the divine assembly while bending it beyond recognition. Wall, listen. Wall, pay close attention. The reed wall could hear. The reed wall would carry the message. The man would understand. Build a boat. Gather the animals. Gather your family. The flood will come. The flood came. Everything perished. The descriptions in the Sumerian texts are brief and terrible. The storm wind, the rising water, the silence afterward. Ziusudra clung to his boat for 7 days and 7 nights. Then the sun came out, and he opened the window, and the world was flat and still and empty. He released birds. The birds came back, or they didn't, and from this he read the shape of the water. Eventually, the boat touched land. Enlil was furious. He had not known of the survival. He felt cheated. And this is worth dwelling on. The rage of the storm god who had decreed annihilation and found that one thin thread of life had been pulled through the eye of the catastrophe. The fury was real. The other gods had to intervene, had to talk him down, had to point out that life continued. Some versions have Enki defending himself openly. I did not break the oath directly. A dream spoke, a wall heard, and Enlil gradually accepted it, accepted the persistence of humanity. Ziusudra was made immortal. He was placed at the mouth of the rivers, at the world's edge, at the place where the sun rises. Dilmun again, the pure land, the paradise from which the world was ordered. He became the man who did not die, the keeper of a secret that no one else would ever be given. He had been inside the flood and come out the other side. He had the knowledge that the world could end and the world could continue, and these were not contradictions. Enki had made this possible. This is his legacy from the flood, that humanity continues, that the recipe was preserved, that somewhere in the Abzu, even after the water receded and the land dried and the cities were rebuilt and the kings were restored and the whole elaborate apparatus of civilization was reassembled on the silt, Enki had the me still. The blueprints were still there. If the world ended again, he would still know what to do. Now I want to tell you about Gilgamesh, because Gilgamesh is the place where all these currents meet. He was born to a human king of Uruk named Lugalbanda, and to Ninsun, the divine wild cow, the goddess whose prayers were the most effective in the heavens. This lineage made him 2/3 divine by the strange arithmetic the Sumerians used for such things, and 1/3 human, which meant he could die. He knew this. He was obsessed with it in a way that the texts don't try to psychologize and don't need to. The fact speaks for itself. He was the most powerful human who had ever lived. He had been given more than any human had ever been given, and he would still die. The difference between 2/3 and the full measure was exactly large enough to be unbearable. He ruled Uruk with an energy that the early tablets describe as frightening. He built the walls of Uruk, the great walls, the ones that the epic opens and closes by describing, the ones that Gilgamesh himself is told to go look at when his grief has exhausted itself, the ones that are still present in the archaeological record in some form, still half visible under the Iraqi soil. He was violent, probably. He was overwhelming. The people of Uruk prayed to the gods to moderate him, and the gods responded by creating his double. Enkidu was made from clay by Aruru, the mother goddess, and was shaped in the image of the god of the sky, the celestial ideal. He lived in the wilderness with the animals. He ran with the gazelles and drank at the waterholes with the beasts, and did not know what he was. A hunter saw him and was afraid because this creature at the waterhole was filling in the pits and lifting out the traps, undoing the mechanisms by which the human world tried to manage the wild. The hunter went to Uruk. He told the king, and Gilgamesh, who understood things at the level of his body before he understood them with his mind, knew what to do. He sent a temple woman, a sacred prostitute from the house of Ishtar, to the waterhole to sit for 3 days and show herself. And when Enkidu came, she drew him to her, and they lay together for 6 days and 7 nights. When it was over, the gazelles ran from Enkidu. His old knowledge was gone. His body had been altered, not weakened exactly, but changed in a way that made the animal world strange to him. He had been introduced to wisdom. The temple woman told him about the great king in Uruk, the king who was causing grief to his people, and Enkidu burned with something that might have been indignation and might have been recognition. He went to Uruk. They fought at the gate. Gilgamesh was stronger and threw him, and in the throwing something passed between them that neither of them had words for yet. They became, this is the word the texts use, friends, brothers. The bond between them was the structuring principle of the rest of the story. Everything that happened afterward happened because they were together. The cedar forest, the monster Humbaba, set by Enlil to guard the forest of sacred trees, whose breath was fire and whose face was a mass of terror. Gilgamesh wanted to cut down the trees, wanted to make a name, wanted to do something that would outlast his mortal body. Enkidu was afraid, which is what the texts say honestly, without shame. He had lived in the wild. He knew what Humbaba was, but he followed. They killed Humbaba. The sun god Shamash helped them, sent the great winds to blind the guardian, sent helpers who clouded his sight. Gilgamesh hesitated at the final blow, hesitated in a way that might have been mercy, and Enkidu pushed him forward. The trees fell. The name was made. Then Ishtar. She wanted Gilgamesh for herself, the goddess of love and war, the great Inanna in her Akkadian form, and Gilgamesh refused her. He listed her previous lovers and what she had done to them. Dumuzi the shepherd, weeping now in the underworld, the Allalu bird, broken-winged, the lion made into a pit, the horse ridden bloody, the shepherd boy turned into a spider. He named her beautiful, and he named her ruinous, and he said no. This was an enormous mistake, or an enormous act of courage, or these were the same thing. She sent the bull of heaven. The bull of heaven came down, and with each snort killed hundreds of men in the pits that opened before it. Gilgamesh and Enkidu fought it together. Enkidu held the horns, while Gilgamesh drove his sword between the shoulders. Ishtar stood on the wall and mourned. Enkidu took the bull's haunch and threw it at her. After this, the gods held council. Someone had to pay for the death of Humbaba, guardian of Enlil's forest. Someone had to pay for the death of the bull of heaven, the divine animal Anu had sent at Ishtar's request. Gilgamesh was too valuable. The great king, the walls of Uruk, the 2/3 divine, the logic of divine justice fell on Enkidu. He sickened slowly. The texts describe 12 days of illness, during which Enkidu cursed, and then forgave the hunter and the temple woman, during which he described a dream of the underworld, the dark house where the dead go in their clay garments, where the great and the small sit alike in the dust, where the kings serve meat and pour cool water for the gods below. He died. Gilgamesh did not understand death until now. He had known it intellectually, in the way that you know anything that has not yet touched you. Now it was in the room with him, in the body of his friend, and he sat beside it for 7 days and 7 nights, until a worm fell from Enkidu's nostril, and then he understood. Not a worm from the earth, not a worm you would find in the garden, a specific worm from a specific nose that told him everything he had been refusing to know. He left Uruk. He crossed the world looking for Utnapishtim, the man who had survived the flood and been given immortality, the one person alive who knew the secret of not dying. The journey took him through the mountains, where the scorpion men guard the tunnel of the sun, through the waters of death that no living person had ever crossed, to the edge of the world where Utnapishtim sat with his wife in the garden of the gods. Utnapishtim told him the story of the flood. This is the moment in the epic where everything converges. The oldest story, the story of Enki's intervention, the story of the one man saved, is given to the one living man who is so determined to not die that he has crossed the world. Gilgamesh heard the flood story and understood that it was not a recipe he could follow. The flood was over. The gods would not make that exception again. Utnapishtim had been placed here because the flood happened once and would not happen again, and so the man who survived it once was a monument to a sealed event. There was no door there, but Utnapishtim's wife convinced her husband to tell Gilgamesh something, a consolation prize, or perhaps a test. At the bottom of the sea, she said, there is a plant, a thorned plant, like a rose. It will prick your hands as you take it, but if you take it and bring it up and eat it, it will give you back your youth, not immortality. Youth, the softness of the beginning, the energy of the early body, the body before it starts to learn what it is. Gilgamesh dove. He tied stones to his feet and walked along the bottom and found the plant and took it, thorns cutting his palms, and carried it up. He was going home. He was going to eat the plant or bring it to Uruk and test it on an old man first and see, or keep it until he needed it. He was not sure. The tablets are not sure. He was carrying it, and that was enough for now. He stopped to bathe in a pool on the journey home. A serpent smelled the fragrance of the plant. It came up from the water and took the plant and disappeared back below. As it went, it shed its skin. It was new. It was young. The serpent went down with the only thing that could have given Gilgamesh what he wanted and left him on the bank with nothing. He sat down and wept. He came home to Uruk. The epic ends in the version we have, which is incomplete, which has gaps and damaged sections like all the old texts. With Gilgamesh speaking to his boatman, the man who had ferried him across the waters of death. He tells him to look at the walls of Uruk, the great walls, the fired brickwork, the foundations laid by the 7 sages. See the outer wall, how its brightness gleams. See the inner wall without equal. Touch the threshold, which is ancient. Go in and walk to Iana, the house of Ishtar. See how the brickwork shines. These bricks were not laid by any ordinary hand. This is how the epic ends, in the walls, in the city, in the thing that outlasts you if you build it well enough. Anyway, the other great figures of the Sumerian mythological world were not tested in quite the same way as Gilgamesh, but they were tested. Inanna descended into the underworld. This needs to be said fully, because it is one of the oldest stories of death and return in the human record, and it is still fully strange. She went down into the realm of her sister Ereshkigal of her own will, dressed in her 7 garments and ornaments, carrying the full weight of her divine power. At each of the 7 gates of the underworld, she was stripped of one item: her crown, her lapis lazuli measuring rod, her necklace, her breast ornaments, her gold ring, her breastplate, her robe, and arrived at the throne of Ereshkigal, naked and bowed low. Ereshkigal was not welcoming. The texts describe the scene in the underworld in language that is cold and compressed. The fastening of the eye of death upon her, the word of wrath spoken against her, the stroke of illness. Inanna died. She was hung on a hook, like a piece of meat. After 3 days and 3 nights, her servant Ninshubar, whom she had instructed before descending, went to the great gods to beg for help. She went to Enlil. He refused. She went to Nanna. He refused. She went to Enki. Enki was troubled. The texts say he was troubled, which is one of those places where a single word carries more weight than it should. He fashioned 2 creatures from the dirt under his fingernail, small, sexless beings, mourners, people who could pass into the underworld because they were too small to matter. He gave one the food of life, and one the water of life, and told them to go down and find Inanna and sprinkle the food and water on her corpse 60 times. They went. They entered the underworld. They found Ereshkigal groaning on her throne, in labor or ill or mourning. The texts differ, and they moaned with her. They mirrored her pain back to her, and she was so moved by this empathy that she offered them gifts. They asked for the corpse hanging on the hook. She gave it. They sprinkled the food of life and the water of life 60 times, and Inanna rose. But the underworld does not release anyone for free. She had to provide a substitute. She ascended surrounded by the demons of the underworld, who would take whoever she designated. She passed her servant Ninshubar, who was grieving in mourning clothes, and did not give him. She passed others who mourned, and did not give them. She arrived in a garden and found Dumuzi, her husband, the shepherd god, sitting on a high throne in fine clothes, not mourning at all. She looked at him. The texts record only the look, the eye of death, the same eye that had been turned on her, now directed at him. The demons took him. Dumuzi fled. He was transformed into a gazelle to escape, was hidden by his sister Geshtinanna, was found and lost and found again. Eventually, a bargain was struck. Dumuzi would spend half the year in the underworld, and Geshtinanna would spend the other half. They would alternate. The shepherd would be below when the flocks are resting and the earth is bare, and rise when the lambs are born and the grass comes back. This is the explanation the Sumerians gave for the cycle of the seasons, not as metaphor, not as allegory, but as the literal consequence of what happened when Inanna came back from the dead and found her husband sitting on his throne in clean clothes. The agricultural calendar was a story of divine grief and divine punishment, played out twice yearly, every year, without end. Enki appears in this story only briefly at the rescue, but his role is pivotal in the way the quiet interventions are pivotal. The small, sexless creatures made from dirt under his fingernail, the food of life and the water of life, the knowledge of what to do when someone is stuck on a hook in the underworld. He knew what to do because he knew what the underworld was, because he knew the structure of the cosmos from the bottom of the Abzu to the top of the heavens. And somewhere in that knowledge was the precise mechanism for reversing death. He didn't go himself. He sent his proxies. He solved the problem from a distance with instruments too small for anyone to stop. This is also characteristic of Enki. There were 5 great sages who came before the flood: the Abgallu, the fishmen who rose from the sea at the command of Enki to teach each era of humanity what it needed to know. After the flood, there were more: the post-diluvian sages, partly human, less obviously divine, carrying attenuated versions of the original knowledge. Each one presided over a particular king. Each one transmitted a particular body of craft and wisdom. The tradition of the Abgallu was the tradition of Enki made portable, made transmissible, distributed into the human world in the form of advisors who knew things that ordinary humans did not. The cuneiform scribal tradition was itself understood as part of this inheritance. The scribes who wrote the tablets, who copied and recopied and preserved and transmitted the mythological texts we are working from right now, sitting in the Adapa, the tablet house, under oil lamps in rooms that smelled like wet clay. Those scribes believed themselves to be in a line that went back to the first sage, to Adapa, to the teaching of Enki. They were not recording stories, they were maintaining a technology. The tablets were not literature in the modern sense. They were a survival system, a repository of the me, a way of keeping the knowledge available so that if the flood came again, something would persist. This is one of the things I find most moving about the whole tradition, and I'm going to take a moment with it, even if it slows the momentum of the story. The people who kept these texts alive were mostly anonymous. We know the names of a few scribes, a few temple officials who authorized copies, a few kings who ordered collections to be made. Ashurbanipal, the Assyrian king, in the 7th century BCE, commissioned a systematic collection of the mythological texts for his library at Nineveh, the library that the German archaeologists excavated in the 19th century CE, the tablets that George Smith was reading in 1872 when he came to the flood story and recognized what he had and reportedly ran into the street. The chain of transmission runs from the Sumerian scribal schools of the 3rd millennium BCE through the Babylonian and Assyrian scribal traditions to the Royal Library at Nineveh, to the excavation spoils of the British Museum, to a young man running through Victorian London with a clay tablet in his hands. Enki made that chain possible, or the Sumerians believed he made it possible, which is the same thing for our purposes. The world changed. It always does. The city-states of Sumer rose and fell in cycles that the Sumerians themselves theorized in the form of the Sumerian king list, a document that records the kings of each city in sequence, noting which city held hegemony at which period, with the periodization framed in terms of divine favor kingship descended from heaven and rested on this city, and then moved to another city, and then another. The shifts were military reality framed as cosmic plan. Enlil withdrew his favor from Kish and gave it to Uruk. He withdrew it from Uruk and gave it to Ur. When Ur fell to the Amorites and the Elamites around 2000 BCE, scribes composed the lament for the destruction of Ur in a voice of such concentrated grief that it remains one of the most affecting texts in the ancient world. The city is empty. The roads are silent. The dogs and foxes have taken the temples. Nana, the city's divine patron, has left. Enlil decreed it. Enki is not the central figure of these laments, but he is present in the structure of them. The me that he held, that he distributed, the decrees that govern the functioning of cities, of kingships, of temples. The laments are the documentation of what happens when the me are withdrawn, when the decree of civilization is suspended, when the water stops running and the grain fails and the streets fill with the bodies of the dead. The negative image of everything Enki's order guaranteed. This is also a technology of the culture to describe the worst that can happen as the withdrawal of divine infrastructure, to make the horror of conquest and famine and the collapse of civilization legible as a cosmic event, a temporary perturbation in the divine order, not the end of the order itself. The order persists even when the city burns. The me are still in the Abzu. Enki still knows where they are. Eventually, someone will be sent to restore them. Let me try to say something about time. Not Sumerian time specifically, not the chronology of the dynasties, but the way the mythological tradition thought about the shape of history. There was a sense, clear in the texts, that the first time was the best time. The land of Dilmun, where the first things happened, was a land before disease and old age, a place where the lion did not kill, where the wolf did not take the lamb, where the sick eye did not say, "I am sick of eye." This is a vision of paradise that is also a vision of a childhood that never actually existed, the imagined before time when the conditions were perfect and the fall had not yet happened. Every mythology has something like this. The Sumerians had Dilmun, the Greeks had the Golden Age, the Hebrews had Eden. The fall from Dilmun was not a single event in Sumerian thought, the way the eating of the apple was a single event. It was accumulated. It was gradual. The flood was one rupture. The death of Enkidu was another. The withdrawal of the me from one city and their grant to another was a smaller but still consequential shift. History in the Sumerian framework was not a straight line progressing toward perfection. It was an oscillation, a series of cycles in which something was given and then withdrawn and then given again in a different form. Enki presided over this oscillation, or at least understood it better than the other gods. The water god, the deep water god, would know about cycles, the tide that comes in and goes out, the flood season and the low water season, the rhythm of the rivers that built the civilization and also regularly destroyed it. There's a patience in the Sumerian portrayal of Enki that other gods lack. He does not rage at the oscillation. He works within it. He finds the thread of life inside the catastrophe and preserves it for the next cycle. This is, I think, the deepest thing the Sumerian mythological tradition was doing with the figure of Enki. The civilization was extremely vulnerable. Mesopotamia had no natural defenses, no mountains to hide behind, no forests to provide timber or isolation. The rivers that made it possible also flooded without warning, changed course, deposited silt in one place and washed it away in another. The climate was unreliable. The political situation was perpetually unstable. The city-states fought each other, and outside powers periodically swept in and took everything. The people living in this environment had to find a way to make meaning of instability, to tell themselves a story in which the cycle of destruction and renewal was not random but ordered, not meaningless but part of a larger plan. Enki was the god who made that story available. The flood was Enlil's rage, but the survival was Enki's intervention. The knowledge was hidden in the deep water, where no flood could reach it. Whatever happened on the surface, war, conquest, the burning of libraries, the destruction of temples, the Abzu remained. The water was still under the earth. The me was still there. Civilization could be rebuilt because civilization's blueprints were indestructible. This was a comfort of a particular kind. It did not promise that things would not be destroyed. It promised that destruction was not final. Anyway, the tablets themselves began to be lost long before we found them. The shift from Sumerian to Akkadian as the dominant language of Mesopotamia happened gradually over centuries, as the Semitic-speaking peoples who had always been present in the region became the politically dominant force. By the time of Hammurabi, in the 18th century BCE, Akkadian was the language of administration and trade and literature, and Sumerian was the language of the temple, preserved in the scribal schools, the way Latin was preserved in the medieval church. A dead language kept alive because it carried the sacred texts. The myths of Enki were translated into Akkadian, and in the translation, they changed. The god's name became Ea. His character remained largely the same. The deep water, the wisdom, the craftiness, the protection of humanity. But the Akkadian versions added their own emphasis, their own theological preoccupations. There is something, this is not quite working as a comparison, I can feel it, but something like watching a song played on different instruments. The melody is recognizable. The key is different. The harmonic overtones change entirely. What you're hearing is both the same thing and not the same thing, and the distance between them is where culture is. The Babylonian tradition built on the Sumerian foundations. The Enuma Elish gave the creation story to Marduk rather than Enki, but Enki as Ea remains central to the human narrative, the advisor of the flood hero, the teacher of the sages, the keeper of the cosmic plans. The flood story in the Epic of Gilgamesh, the Akkadian masterwork of the 2nd millennium BCE, preserved the essential structure. Ea speaking through the wall, the boat, the waters rising, the birds sent out, the sacrifice after the landing, the divine rage, and then the acceptance. The structure was Sumerian. The language was Akkadian. The truth was both. Later still, fragments of the tradition moved into the Berossa's text. The 3rd century BCE Babylonian priest who wrote a history of Mesopotamia in Greek for the Hellenistic world, who transmitted versions of the flood story and the Abgallu myth to an audience that had no framework for understanding them, except through the lens of Greek categories. The Hellenistic world was trying to assimilate the ancient East, and what it produced was a synthesis that satisfied no one entirely. The tradition lost texture in the translation. It became anecdote rather than living myth. Then the tablets were buried, the cities were abandoned, the scribal schools closed, the cuneiform fell out of use, and by the 1st century CE, it was effectively a dead writing system, known to no living person, waiting in the ground under what is now Iraq. The last dated cuneiform tablet is from 75 CE, a Babylonian almanac. After that, silence, 1700 years of silence. And then the archaeologists came. Paul Emile Botta at Khorsabad in 1843, Austin Henry Layard at Nimrud and Nineveh in the 1840s, the tablets by the thousands. George Smith reading the flood story in the British Museum in 1872 and running into the street. The scholars who spent the next century and a half reading, translating, arguing, revising, translating again. Samuel Noah Kramer, who devoted his life to the Sumerian texts and whose popular books in the mid-20th century gave a generation of readers their first sense of what was buried in the ground. The ongoing work, still incomplete, still contested, still producing new readings of texts that have been studied for 150 years. The tablets do not give up their meaning easily. They are damaged. They are fragmentary. The language is difficult, still being understood. The scholars put brackets around the parts they are not sure about, and sometimes the brackets cover half the text. This is what I mean when I say the tradition is alive. It is not alive in the way that a religion is alive, with practitioners and liturgy and a community of believers. It is alive in the way that a language being translated is alive, in the act of attention, the act of someone leaning over a clay tablet with a lamp and trying to hear what it says. Every reading changes what we understand. Every new tablet changes the picture. The story is still being told. The anachroniclic is here if you're looking for it. The idea that civilization has blueprints, that knowledge can be stored where the flood can't reach it, that if you keep the me somewhere safe, the world can always be rebuilt. This is a very contemporary anxiety wearing ancient clothes. We know now what it actually means for a library to burn, for a language to die, for a tradition to lose its last practitioner and become only an artifact. We have seen it happen in our own century, in our own languages. The Sumerian scribes were not wrong to be afraid of this. They were not wrong to build the preservation of knowledge into the structure of their mythology. They were not wrong to make Enki the keeper of the me, one of the gods you could not afford to lose. The walls of Uruk are still there, partly. The baked bricks that Gilgamesh ordered, that the epic tells you to look at when grief has eaten you hollow, are in the ground under the Iraqi desert, excavated and recovered, and excavated again. Less complete every time the political situation prevents archaeological work. The tablets are in the British Museum, and in Istanbul, and in Baghdad, and in Berlin, and in Philadelphia, and in dozens of other institutions around the world, some of them never fully translated, some of them missing the sections that would complete a story we know only in outline. The flood story in the Epic of Gilgamesh was missing its key section for decades. The tablet fragment that contained it was sitting in a collection in Turkey, unidentified until 2011. when a researcher recognized it and the story was restored. 17 lines, recovered, the water running again. This is the shape of Enki's legacy, finally. It is not the shape of a triumph. It is not the story of a god who won, who established an order that persisted, who built a thing that could not be broken. Enki's legacy is a practice, the practice of preserving the thing that makes civilization possible through every catastrophe, in whatever form will survive the catastrophe. Sometimes that is a clay tablet. Sometimes it is a story told around a fire. Sometimes it is a researcher in a museum basement who turns over a fragment and recognizes a shape she has been looking for without knowing it. The me do not reside in the Abzu anymore. The Abzu is not under the earth in the way the Sumerians believed. But something is. Something is still there, under every city, under every tradition, under every language that was lost and found again. The blueprint of the attempt, the record of what was tried, the evidence that it worked once, imperfectly, for a while, before the water came. Enki knew this. He knew it from the beginning, from before the beginning, from the primal water where Nammu held everything that had not yet happened. He knew that the world would end and the world would continue, and these were not contradictions. He knew that the task was not to prevent the flood. The task was to know where the boat was. The old word for this kind of knowing, and I am reaching here. I know I am reaching, but I am going to reach anyway because this is what the texts do to you. They make you reach, was Nammu, wisdom, the full accumulation of technical knowledge, the thing Enki held in his house in the deep water, that Inanna came to drink beer and take, that Adapa was given and then told to refuse, that the flood scattered and the scribes collected and the archaeologists found and the scholars are still translating. It is not a comfortable thing, Nammu. It does not guarantee survival. It does not prevent the serpent from taking the plant. It does not stop the worm from falling from Enkidu's nostril. It holds the knowledge of how things work, which includes the knowledge of how they fail. It holds the me of descent to the underworld and the me of ascent from the underworld, which is only useful if you accept that the descent will happen. You do not get the return without the going down. The Sumerians built the world's first cities. They invented writing. They wrote down their stories and their laws and their accounting records and their astronomical observations on clay tablets that were meant to be temporary and turned out to be permanent, preserved by the fires that destroyed the buildings that housed them. Every burned archive became an accidental time capsule. Every catastrophe preserved what it could have simply deleted. There is a sentence. I keep trying to write this sentence, and it keeps not quite landing, so I'm going to take a run at it and see what happens. There is a thing that Enki understood about the relationship between deep things and lasting things, about how the me had to be kept below, kept in the water, kept in the place that floods could not reach, because the surface is where floods go and the deep is where the record survives. The surface is where you build cities. The deep is where you keep the plans. We are still working from his plans. The tablets are still being read. The story is still incomplete. The scholars still put brackets around the parts they cannot make out. And Nammu is still down there somewhere, the primal water before the word for water, patient and without a face, holding everything that has not yet happened. He was the deep water. He was the knowing. He was the thing that survives. But let me go back. Let me go back to the Abzu itself, because I skimmed past it, and it deserves more than I gave it. The Abzu was not, in the Sumerian conception, simply an underground ocean. It was the source of all fresh water on Earth, a cosmological necessity, not a geological hypothesis. The rivers did not have their own source. They were fed by the Abzu, which was fed by nothing, which simply was. When you dug a well, you were reaching down through the Earth's crust toward the sweet water below. When a spring bubbled up from the ground, that was the Abzu pressing upward, the divine water pushing through the skin of the world. Every temple in Sumer had a ritual pit called the Abzu, a basin or pool that symbolized the cosmic freshwater ocean, the connection between the earthly structure of the temple and the divine foundation on which everything rested. The priests performed rituals at these pools. The water was not decorative. The water was the connection. To live in Eridu, the city of Enki, was to live directly above the Abzu. The city was positioned at the place where the sweet water met the salt water, at the mouth of the rivers, at the edge of the Persian Gulf. The excavations at the site showed temple after temple built one on top of another, each one slightly larger than the last, going back to the earliest layers of Mesopotamian settlement. 6,000 years of continuous worship at a single site, each generation adding a layer, the whole structure built on and around the original reed hut that was Enki's first house, a reed hut above the deep water, the humblest possible dwelling and the oldest. This is where Enki received the gods and the humans who came to consult him. This is where Adapa was trained. This is where Inanna came to drink beer, and where the me were kept in the house that was somehow both intimate and infinite. The texts describe Enki's house as full of light, full of music, full of the sound of water, lapis lazuli and silver, and the sweet smell of cedar. He built it himself, or he had it built by his craftsmen, the divine workers whose skill exceeded anything possible in the human world. He furnished it with care. It was a working space, but also a performance of what he was, the god of craft, making the finest thing he knew how to make as demonstration of what craft could achieve. There were other things in the Abzu besides the me. There were the plans, the divine blueprints for every human craft and art, the plan of the temple which the god gave to the king in a dream before each construction, the plan of the city which was established in heaven before it was expressed on earth, the plan of the human body, which Enki and Ninhursag drew up together during the first making. All of these were stored in the Abzu, updated and revised by cosmic events, available to anyone who knew how to ask. The asking was the hard part. You could not walk up to the Abzu and knock on the door. The Abzu was under the earth. To access its knowledge, you needed a conduit, a sage, a priest, a dream, a ritual that opened the channel between the surface world and the deep. The Abgallu served this function. The divination priests served this function. The scribes who worked in the temple schools served this function in their way, copying texts that preserved the divine knowledge in a form that could be consulted without direct access to the divine source. Every literate person in Mesopotamia was, in a small way, a proxy for Enki, someone who maintained the chain of transmission, who kept the me in circulation, who ensured that the blueprint did not get lost. This is why literacy was sacred. This is why the tablet house, the Adapa, was also a temple. This is why the scribes invoked Enki and his son Asaluhi, the divine scribe, the god of incantation, at the beginning of their work. They were not being metaphorical. They believed they were doing what they were doing, maintaining the divine knowledge in the human world, keeping the Abzu's contents available on the surface, being the living version of the deep storage. The curriculum in the Adapa was brutal. The students copied lists of gods, lists of animals, lists of trees, lists of stones, lists of professions, lists of the names for everything that existed. They copied proverbs and hymns and legal codes. They were beaten if they got things wrong, and the texts preserve complaints about this. Student voices complaining about the teachers, teachers complaining about the students, everyone complaining about the conditions. It is very recognizable, the suffering of the school. But embedded in the curriculum, underneath the brutal lists and the copying exercises, was the understanding that what they were doing was cosmic maintenance. The list of all the trees was not just a vocabulary exercise. It was a version of the divine catalogue, the list that Enki held, the naming of the world's contents that kept the world in order. Every student who memorized the names of the trees was holding a thread of the net that kept things from falling apart. The Sumerians worried constantly about forgetting. The laments, the genre of texts that describe the destruction of cities, are partly political documentation, partly theological reflection, and partly the expression of a deep anxiety about cultural continuity. When a city was destroyed, its records were destroyed, its scribes were killed or scattered. The chain of transmission was broken. The me of that city, its specific version of the divine decrees, its particular relationship with its patron god, was in danger of being lost entirely. The conquerors might know how to build cities. They might know many things. But they did not know the specific knowledge of this city, the accumulated local wisdom that had been developed over centuries and stored in the tablet houses and maintained by the trained scribes, and was now nowhere. This is what the lament for the destruction of is grieving, underneath the grief for the dead and the destroyed buildings. It is grieving the knowledge, the scribal tradition of the specific liturgical forms, the local variations on the great myths, all of it in danger of disappearing because the city that maintained it was gone. Enki protected against this in the mythology by keeping the master copies in the Abzu. Whatever was lost on the surface could be recovered from below. The human record might burn, the divine record would not. This was the promise, and the Mesopotamian scribal tradition enacted this promise by making copies of everything, by maintaining multiple copies of the major texts in multiple cities, by training new scribes even when the political situation was catastrophic, by continuing to copy the old texts, even when the society had shifted so thoroughly that the language in which the texts were written was no longer spoken by anyone alive. The Sumerian literary corpus was preserved almost entirely by Babylonian scribes who could read Sumerian the way a medieval European scholar could read Latin, with effort, with training, as a dead sacred language. The copies we have are almost all Babylonian copies of Sumerian originals made during the Old Babylonian period around 2000 to 1600 BCE. The originals were already centuries old. Some of them were already damaged. Some of them were already partially illegible. The scribes copied the illegible parts with brackets or with scribal notes indicating that the original was difficult to read, or simply with gaps, honest acknowledgements that something had been lost. We are reading Babylonian copies of damaged Sumerian originals, translated from cuneiform by modern scholars who disagree about several of the key terms, filtered through 150 years of developing scholarship, and then further processed through the inevitably interpretive act of translating the translations into modern prose. And yet, the thing itself comes through. The water god in his underwater house, full of light and music. The clever god who solves the problem that force cannot solve. The god who could not give humanity everything, but gave them the most important things. The god who could not prevent the flood but knew where to keep the boat. It comes through. It survives the layers. It is still recognizable. Now I want to talk about the part of the tradition that most scholars consider the most philosophically interesting. The question of what the me actually were. The standard translation is divine decrees or divine powers, and both of these are accurate and both of them miss something. The me were not laws in the sense of commandments. There is no voice saying, "Thou shalt." They were more like functions, like the operating instructions of the universe. The me of kingship was not the rule that kings should rule. It was the operational reality of kingship, the specific set of practices and authorities and relationships that made it possible for a human being to function as a king. If you held the me of kingship, you could perform kingship. If it was taken from you or transferred to someone else, you became incapable of the functions even if you remained physically present on the throne. The me were not symbolic. They were technical. This creates an interesting theological problem, which the Sumerians seem to have enjoyed rather than tried to resolve. If the me are technical functions, if kingship is kingship because someone holds the operational capability, then what happens to the divine hierarchy when the me change hands? When Inanna took the me from Enki, did she become more powerful than Enki? When a city's patron god lost the me of kingship, did that god lose the capacity to rule? The texts suggest yes, roughly. The divine order was not fixed. It depended on who held what. Enki's strategy was to hold the master copies. He was not the most powerful god in the Sumerian pantheon. That was Enlil by general acknowledgement in matters of governance. But he was the most knowledgeable about the structure of power. He knew how the me worked, not just what they were. He knew the mechanism. A knowledge of the mechanism is a different kind of power than the power that comes from holding a specific function. It is the power of the engineer rather than the executive. The executive can issue commands. The engineer knows which commands are possible. The story of Enki and Inanna, the beer and the me and the boat of heaven, turns on exactly this distinction. Inanna took the me. She took the functions. She brought them to Uruk and distributed them to humanity. But she could not have known how to do this without the structure that Enki had built. She took the parts. He still held the blueprint. She could use the tools. He still understood why the tools worked. The me in Uruk would eventually need maintenance, revision, renewal. And for that, for the deeper knowledge of how the cosmic operating system ran, she would have to come back to the Abzu. They knew this. Both of them knew this. The whole transaction, the drunken gift, and the chasing messengers, and the gracious final acceptance of the outcome. It was a negotiation, a division of roles. She would hold the me in the human world, in the city, where they were needed. He would hold the understanding of what the me were and how they worked, in the Abzu, where they could be kept safe. Neither one had everything. Together, they had the full system. This is actually quite sophisticated as a theology of knowledge. The distinction between possessing a tool and understanding a tool is real and important. The distinction between exercising power and understanding how power works is real and important. The Sumerians were not making this up abstractly. They were observing something that was true about their own society, about the relationship between the king who exercised power and the scribe who knew how the administrative system worked, between the general who commanded the army and the engineer who built the walls. Enki was the god of the scribes and the engineers and the craftsmen and the physicians and the exorcists, all the people whose power depended not on commanding other people, but on understanding how things worked. His worship was most intense in the groups whose social position depended on specialized knowledge. In a society where most power was overtly military or political, the people who held technical knowledge held a different kind of power, less visible, but in many ways more durable. The soldier who holds the city can be defeated. The scribe who holds the administrative knowledge of how the city runs is much harder to replace. Enki represented the insight that this second kind of power was, in the long run, the more important kind. The flood destroyed everything on the surface. The Abzu remained. The conquering army burned the archives. The master copies in the Abzu remained. The political order collapsed in ways that were visible and violent and happened quickly. The technical order recovered, slowly from below, driven by the knowledge that survived in the trained minds of the people who knew how things worked. This is also why Enki protected humanity so persistently. Humanity was not just the labor force the gods had created to do the heavy lifting. Humanity, by Enki's time, was the carrier of the tradition. The scribes and craftsmen and physicians who maintained the knowledge in the human world were doing the same work he did in the Abzu. They were keeping the me accessible. They were keeping the deep knowledge available on the surface. Without them, the Abzu's contents were unactionable, perfectly preserved, but unreachable. The human world and the divine knowledge needed each other, which meant Enki needed humanity the way the Abzu needed the rivers, as a medium of expression, as the surface through which the deep could be known. The flood threatened this. Enlil decreed the flood, and the flood would have destroyed the carriers, the scribes, the craftsmen, the temple singers, the diviners, the people who knew how to do the things that needed to be done. That was why Enki could not let it happen. Not sentimentality, or not only sentimentality, necessity, strategic necessity. If the flood wiped out the human bearers of knowledge, the me would be back in the Abzu and nowhere else. And the Abzu cannot build a city. The Abzu can only give the plans to people who know how to read them. Ziusudra survived. He brought in the boat not just the animals, but the knowledge, the specific know-how that would allow a civilization to be rebuilt. The flood hero in the Sumerian and Babylonian traditions is always, at some level, a preservation act. The knowledge that needs to be carried across the catastrophe, the technical tradition that must not be allowed to go under with the water. This is also, I think, why the texts place such emphasis on the instructions Enki gave Ziusudra, or Utnapishtim in the Akkadian, before the flood. The speaking through the wall, the technical instructions for boat construction, the specific dimensions and materials and proportions. The boat is not just a boat. It is a controlled experiment in how to transmit technical knowledge across an absolute catastrophic break. The walls of the temple hear the instructions and pass them on, and the man who receives them builds the thing that makes the transmission possible. The boat is a tablet. The water is what destroys tablets. The man who builds the boat is the scribe who makes the copies. This is not metaphor. This is the logic of the civilization expressing itself through the language of myth. Let me tell you about the 7 Abgallu properly, because I skipped past them, and they deserve more than a mention. The tradition held that before each of the first 7 kings, there was a corresponding sage, a being of divine or semi-divine origin, born of the water or sent by Enki, who attached himself to the court and transmitted the divine knowledge needed for that era. The first Abgallu was Uana, who appeared before the first king, Alulim of Eridu, and brought the plans of the temple and the rituals of the cult. He was depicted as a fishman, half human and half fish, and in the artistic tradition, he is always shown with a bucket and a pine cone, the tools of purification, sprinkling holy water, conducting the ritual that kept the boundary between the divine and human worlds properly maintained. The 7 Abgallu covered the antediluvian world, the world before the flood. After the flood, the tradition held the sages became less purely divine, more intermixed with humanity, less obviously non-human in their form. The post-diluvian sages were called Ummanu, craftsmen, and they were associated with particular kings in the historical record. Ninson's ward Enmerkar, who built Uruk, had a sage. Gilgamesh had a sage. The great kings of Ur and Babylon and Assyria each had their designated Ummanu, the person who held the technical knowledge, who advised the king on religious matters, who maintained the connection to the Abgallu tradition that went all the way back to Uana, and through Uana to Enki, the 7 fishmen. They appear in the decorative arts of Mesopotamia across thousands of years, carved on cylinder seals, painted on palace walls, depicted in the protective figures buried in the foundations of temples. They were apotropaic images, protective presences, beings whose function was to keep the dangerous knowledge circulating, to keep the channel between the Abzu and the surface world open. Their particular domain was exorcism and healing, because exorcism and healing required the most direct knowledge of the divine order, knowing which demons had power over which illnesses, knowing which rituals would restore the divine harmony that illness and possession had disrupted, knowing the structure of the cosmos well enough to locate the problem and correct it. A sick person was, in the Mesopotamian understanding, someone from whom the divine protection had been withdrawn, someone whose personal god had turned away, or someone who had violated a taboo and broken the connection between themselves and the divine order. Healing was the act of restoring that connection. It required knowledge of both the cosmos and the particular situation, the correct incantation, the correct ritual, the correct combination of material and spiritual intervention. This knowledge came from the Abgallu tradition. The healer who knew what to do was drawing on the me that Enki had held in the Abzu, that the Abgallu had transmitted, that the scribal tradition had preserved. The medical texts of ancient Mesopotamia are detailed and systematic. They classify diseases by symptom, prescribe specific treatments, note the cases where treatment is not possible. They are practical documents, the result of accumulated clinical observation, maintained in the scribal schools and updated as experience demanded. But they are also religious texts, embedded in a framework of divine cause and divine remedy. Every disease has a spiritual component. Every treatment has a ritual component. The physician who treated you was also a priest, or worked closely with a priest. The healer of the body and the healer of the spirit were not separate professions in ancient Mesopotamia. They were two faces of the same knowledge. Enki was the patron of both, the god of wisdom, the god of craft, the god of the deep water that purified and restored. His son Asaluhi was the god of exorcism, and the texts describe the two of them working together on many occasions. Asaluhi coming to his father to report a case that requires intervention, Enki providing the specific ritual knowledge needed. Father and son, practical knowledge and systematic knowledge, the specific case and the general principle. The healing that was possible in the human world was a collaboration between these two levels, the surface and the deep. This is the tradition that produced the oldest surviving medical texts, the oldest systematic observations of natural phenomena, the oldest written legal code, Nammu before Hammurabi, the oldest surviving poetry, the hymn to Inanna, attributed to the priestess Enlil, who lived in the 23rd century BCE, and whose voice is so clear and so individual across 4,000 years that reading her is one of the strangest and most moving experiences the written record can offer. All of this came from the same source, the conviction that the world was ordered, that the order could be known, and that the knowledge could be preserved and transmitted through the generations. The conviction, essentially, that the Abzu was real. Enlil, she was the daughter of Sargon of Akkad, the first great empire builder in Mesopotamian history, the king who unified the city-states of Sumer and Akkad under a single rule for the first time. Sargon appointed her as high priestess of Nanna, the moon god, at a political appointment as much as a religious one, a way of cementing Akkadian control over the Sumerian cult centers by placing a member of the royal family in the highest religious office. She held the position for decades. She wrote. Her surviving compositions are some of the most intensely personal texts in the ancient world. The hymn to Inanna, which she calls the exaltation of Inanna, is a poem that begins as liturgical praise and becomes something else, something almost confessional, as she describes being driven from her position by a usurper and appealing to Inanna to restore her. She says, "I am Enheduanna, the high priestess of Nanna, who serves An and Nanna. In the role of Nanna's end priestess, I carried the ritual basket and I sang the song of joy. But I am no more. The night is mine. I am driven like a swallow from the window. What is mine has been given to another. My Nanna has not defended me. I am Enheduanna. Let me speak to you." The poem is extraordinary for many reasons, but one of them is structural. She is doing what the mythology says humans do when they have been abandoned by their divine patron. She is going over their heads. She is bypassing Nanna, who has failed her, and appealing directly to Inanna, the goddess of love and war and the storehouse of the me, the goddess who went down to the underworld and came back, the goddess who understands what it means to be stripped of everything at the gates and left with nothing. And Inanna responds, or the poem performs the response, which is the same thing. Enheduanna's restoration is described, her reinstatement as high priestess, her vindication. The pattern that the mythology established, the descent, the appeal, the restoration, plays out in historical time, in a real woman's life, documented in a poem that she wrote herself. This is the living tradition, not just the gods telling stories about themselves, but the humans working within the mythological framework, using it as a map for navigating their own experience. Enheduanna being stripped of her position was Inanna being stripped of her garments at the gates of the underworld. Enheduanna appealing to a higher power was the act of going to the one who held the knowledge, going to the figure who, in the cosmic structure, understood what had happened and how to undo it. Enki is not present in Enheduanna's poems in any prominent way, but the structure he built is everywhere. The world she inhabits is the world that his me made possible, the temple with its ritual basin, the scribal tradition that trained her to write, the cosmological framework that gave her the vocabulary for understanding her own suffering and articulating her own appeal. She is drawing on the Abzu, distantly, indirectly, through the thousands of years of transmission that stand between her and the original source. She is also adding to it. Her poems became part of the canon. They were copied and recopied for centuries after her death. The scribal schools used them as teaching texts, her work preserved in the tablet houses alongside the great mythological texts. A historical individual's voice folded into the sacred tradition. She became, in a sense, one more link in the chain that went from Enki through the Abgallu, through the generations of scribes to her, and then through her to the students who copied her words in the Adapa, and then through them to us. We do not know most of their names. The scribal tradition was largely anonymous. Hundreds of thousands of tablets survive. The names of the scribes who made them appear only occasionally, sometimes as subscription at the end of a text, sometimes as part of the curriculum exercise, the student writing his name as part of the copying work. Mostly they are unnamed. Mostly they are the medium through which the knowledge moved, visible only by what they preserved and not at all in themselves. This anonymity is itself significant. It is consistent with what the tradition believed about the nature of the work. The scribe was not the author. The knowledge did not originate with the scribe. The scribe was the channel, the carrier, the professional maintainer of a tradition that went back before human record, that originated in the divine world, that was being trusted to the human world for safekeeping. To put your name on it prominently would have been a kind of category error. You would be claiming authorship of something that belonged to Enki, to the Abgallu, to the gods who established the me before the flood. Enheduanna was unusual in this. Her name survives, attached firmly to her work, across 4,000 years. Possibly this was possible for her, precisely because she was both a historical person with a documented role and a religious figure within the tradition. She was not just copying the old texts, she was producing new ones, and those new ones bore her authority as high priestess. She could sign her work because her position made her work itself authoritative in a way that a simple scribal copy was not. But most of them were anonymous. Most of the people who kept the tradition alive are unknown to us, and perhaps cannot be known, because they understood their role as one of preservation rather than creation, and left no more trace than the medium through which water flows. The water flows through without leaving a name. This is also Enki. The Abzu does not advertise itself. The deep water does not draw attention to the work it does. It simply maintains the supply, keeps the pressure, holds the blueprint safe. The surface may change completely. The cities may rise and fall. The languages may shift. The political orders may collapse and be replaced by other political orders. And the Abzu does not announce whether it is troubled by this. It simply holds what it holds. It waits. It provides when it is asked. In the Mesopotamian hymns, Enki is described in terms that are almost synonymous with the concept of abundance itself. He fills the rivers with fish. He makes the fields yield grain. He is the reason the cities have water and the temples have incense. He is not a god you worship in extremity. He is the God you acknowledge when things are working, when the irrigation system has not broken, when the harvest has come in and the children are not sick. He is the God of the operating conditions of civilization, the divine maintenance of the circumstances under which ordinary life is possible. This makes him harder to dramatize than Inanna, who descends into the underworld and comes back changed. Harder to dramatize than Enlil, who sends the flood and then rages at the survival. Harder to dramatize than Gilgamesh, who is visibly, painfully human in his grief and his searching. Enki mostly does things that work. He mostly solves problems that would otherwise be catastrophic. He mostly maintains things that would otherwise fall apart. The drama of successful maintenance is quiet. The texts praise him effusively and then move on to the exciting part where someone else does something dramatic. But without the Abzu, there is no drama at all. Without the me, there are no cities, no kings, no temples, no scribes, no texts. Without the deep water, the surface has nothing to hold it. Enki is the substrate. He is the condition under which the other stories are possible. He is the thing you do not notice until it is gone. The Sumerians were a people who noticed it. They knew, in the specific practical way of people who live next to rivers in a desert, that water is not guaranteed. They knew that the irrigation channels could fail that the floods could be too much or too little, that the sweet water could go salt, that the Abzu could, in some sense, withdraw. They had experienced this withdrawal in the form of drought and in the form of catastrophic flood, in the form of the river shifting its course and leaving a city stranded, in the form of the salinization that eventually made the fields of southern Mesopotamia too salt to grow grain. The worship of Enki was the acknowledgement that the deep water was not automatic. It required attention, ritual maintenance, the proper performance of the relationship between the human world and the divine source. The Abzu basins in the temples were not decorative. They were the mechanism of maintenance, the ritual expression of the dependency. The priests who performed the rituals at the Abzu basins were doing the same thing the irrigation engineers did when they cleared the channels and repaired the dikes. They were maintaining the supply. They were ensuring that the deep water kept flowing. When the Abzu was properly maintained, civilization worked. When it was not, when the rituals lapsed, when the temples were abandoned, when the chain of transmission was broken, the knowledge failed, and then everything downstream of the knowledge failed too. This is not superstition. This is a sophisticated understanding of how complex systems depend on constant maintenance, and how maintenance depends on the persistence of the knowledge of how to maintain things. The Sumerians encoded this understanding in the mythology of Enki. They made it sacred, which is what you do with the things you most need people to take seriously. The maintenance of the Abzu was not a professional responsibility. It was a divine obligation. The scribes who kept the texts were not clerks. They were priests. The knowledge they preserved was not useful information. It was sacred cargo, entrusted to them by the gods, transmitted through the Abgallu, traceable all the way back to the first moment when Enki put the me in his house and decided to keep them safe. They were right to make it sacred. The civilizations that did not maintain the knowledge lost it. The archives that were not copied burned and were not recovered. The languages that were not taught died. We know this not as theory, but as the archaeological record of the actual disappearance of actual things that could not be recovered. We have the negative evidence everywhere, the texts that are missing, the gaps in the tablet catalogues, the names of works we know existed because they are referred to in other texts but have never been found. Everything that survived because someone, at some point, in some quiet room, decided to make a copy. Enki is the patron saint of those people, the anonymous scribes in the Adapa, working by lamplight, copying texts in a language no one spoke anymore, in a script that only they could read, preserving knowledge whose practical application they may not have fully understood. They did it because the tradition said the knowledge was sacred. They did it because the knowledge was in their custody, entrusted to them by those who came before, to be passed on to those who came after. They did it because the Abzu was real to them, and the Abzu needed maintainers. The cuneiform script was forgotten for 1700 years. Then the scholars came and spent 150 years relearning it, reconstructing the language, retranslating the text, arguing over the brackets. They are still arguing. New tablets are still being identified in museum collections, still being read for the first time in 4,000 years. The Abzu is still giving up its contents, slowly, partially, in the hands of people who know how to read the shapes in the clay. Enki would find this entirely satisfactory. The knowledge went under. The knowledge came back. The deep thing persisted. The surface recovered from its catastrophe, and the deep thing was still there, still accessible to those who knew how to ask, still holding the me, still maintaining the blueprint. He was always going to be here. He is the water under everything. He is what your hands are reaching for when you dig. He is the knowing that does not announce itself. He is the patience of the very deep things, the ones that outlast every king and every flood and every empire that thought it had finally settled the question of what matters. He is the answer the earth gives when you drill far enough down. Water, sweet water, still. Good night. The tablets are safe. The Abzu holds. Sleep well.